is Bean to Barstool, a podcast that looks at the intersections of craft beer and craft chocolate. My name is David Nilsson. I'm a professional beer writer and an advanced cicerone, and the creator and host of this show. The music for this episode is by my dear friend, indie folk musician Anna P.S. You can find out more about Anna's music in the show notes or at her website, annapsmusic.com. You can find links and information about our guests in the show notes as well. I hope you enjoy this episode of Bean to Barstool. Hey everyone, this is David. Thanks for listening to the Bean to Barstool podcast. Enjoy. When we get together to enjoy beer or chocolate or some other indulgence, we call the event a tasting, but that's not really accurate. We use all of our senses in the process of savoring our favorite artisan foods and drinks, in conscious ways and in ways that run beneath the surface. Because our brains take in information from multiple senses every time we eat or drink, they've come to build up associations we aren't always aware of, and those connections can become an important part of the experience of enjoying a particular food or drink in the future. The pop, pop, pop of corn kernels when your popcorn is almost done, or the frothing exhalation of an espresso machine that means the latte you ordered is almost ready, build anticipation and become a part of the enjoyment of those treats. French silk pie owes its name to a texture, not a flavor, and red velvet cake partially does too. If I ask you what color the flavor of banana is, most of you probably immediately think yellow, even though we don't actually eat the part of the banana that is. The tasting experience is always about more than taste. Our brains are intricate machines anchored by memory, conditioned by time, informed by our senses, compelled by imagination, and colored by emotion. The tasting experience is about all those separate tones of who we are coming together into a perfect chord, and as we learn to release ourselves into that process each time we taste, those experiences string together into a song. A few months back, we played with these sensory associations when we asked artist Katie Clark Gabbard to put paint to canvas in response to tasting beers and chocolates without knowing what they were. The results were illuminating. Today, we're going to talk with a chocolate professional who uses the connection between flavor and color to help people better understand what they're tasting in their favorite chocolate. This is Bean to Barstool, a podcast that looks at the intersections between craft beer and craft chocolate, using them as lenses for exploring the world of flavor and the way flavor interacts with our memories, emotions, imaginations, and even our identities to teach us more about who we are. My name is David Nilsson. I'm a professional beer writer and educator and an advanced cicerone. In this episode, we'll talk with Hazel Lee, an international chocolate judge and the creator of Taste with Color, the chocolate tasting flavor map. We talk about how Hazel got into chocolate, what led to the development of her flavor map, and how it's used to deepen and inform the experience of tasting chocolate for both newcomers and experienced tasters. The music for this episode is from the song Umbrella by my dear friend, indie folk musician Anna P.S. You can find out more about Anna's music in the show notes or at her website, annapsmusic.com, where you can also get in touch to book her to play at your brewery or other establishment. I hope you enjoy this episode of Bean to Barstool.
I noticed that when I saw the words written down on a piece of paper, it would help me, it would prompt me to know what I was tasting. But I realized that I was seeing colors in my mind first, and I was speaking in colors. I was saying, right, first of all, I get a little hint of green, and then it becomes yellow and red, and then a little bit more purple, and it finishes with a little bit of brown. And I realized that none of the tools we had simply categorized flavors by color.
That's Hazel Lee, a food scientist in Great Britain, describing the realization that led to creating Taste with Color, a visual map that helps people identify flavors in chocolate by making color associations. Hazel is an international chocolate judge and consultant. Her interest in chocolate started at university when she took a job at Hotel Chocolat in Leeds, and her connection to the world of bean to bar really took off on a trip she took in 2013.
It was 2013. I wanted to go on holiday by myself, and I didn't want to just hop hostels and go drinking, which a lot of people do when they go traveling. I wanted to do something food or drink related. So I looked at volunteering and I thought maybe I'll volunteer on a coffee farm in Colombia or something. And then through a website called Workaway, I found this cocoa farm in the Costa Rican jungle called La Iguana Chocolate that were looking for volunteers. And I thought, oh, that sounds perfect. And the dates and the flights all aligned. And I went to volunteer at this cocoa farm in the middle of the jungle in Costa Rica. And that's when I met cacao in the flesh for the first time. I was making chocolate in the jungle, which is really not the best environment. But that's when it really kickstarted. And I thought, I love chocolate even more than I realized. And I had an amazing experience there, you know, working and harvesting the cacao and then roasting it and turning it into chocolates and trying to temper on the little cocoa farm. And when I got home, I set myself the challenge to make chocolate from the bean using equipment that I had in my kitchen or at home. And I was using, you know, a hairdryer classic for winnowing and a typical domestic oven. And I found a spare granite floor tile I was trying to temper with. But I did have to invest in one piece of equipment, which was the roller refiner, because it's just not possible to get that smooth texture without it. So I did invest in one piece of equipment, but otherwise I was successful. And I started then making chocolate from the bean. I started Instagramming and using hashtag bean to bar, and somehow I, you know, started connecting with people online, and living very close to London and working in the food industry, I managed to, you know, go to events in London and start making connections with people through my passion. And from there, it just started to develop organically.
That volunteering experience sounds so cool. That's like such a cool way to get introduced to the whole thing, just kind of getting thrown into the deep end, sort of. What led to starting Taste with Color then?
Yeah, so it was a few years later, and I have a regular group of other chocolate fans, other members of the chocolate industry. We get together every couple of months or so to have a little tasting session. Sometimes we'd have a theme, but we'd all bring some bars and we would taste together and share our notes, and would bring a variety of different tasting tools, like a variety of the flavor wheels that are out there. There are many different versions, particularly in the coffee industry and the wine industry and the beer industry. They're very commonly used. And then sometimes we would have a list of common flavor notes in front of us. There's a variety of different tools, but I noticed that when I saw the words written down on a piece of paper, it would help me, it would prompt me to know what I was tasting. But I realized that I was seeing colors in my mind first, and I was speaking in colors. I was saying, right, first of all, I get a little hint of green, and then it becomes yellow and red, and then a little bit more purple, and it finishes with a little bit of brown. And I realized that none of the tools we had simply categorized flavors by color, because these flavor wheels, they are colorful, but it's usually all red for fruits and not all fruits are red, you know, all green for the slightly vegetal notes, whereas there's still a variety of colors of vegetal notes. You can get a red bell pepper note, for example, or tomatoey notes. And that is simply what I decided to create. I like seeing the words written down because it prompts me to know that's what I'm tasting, but the color comes first. So I decided to create the tool literally to help myself. So I just did some watercolor painting of the variety of colors that I find in tasting chocolate that were in my common language. I wrote a list of the common flavor notes that I would find when tasting, and tried to make it look aesthetically pleasing, not just, blobs of color here and there, and that they would overlap slightly. And originally I was going to call it the chocolate tasting prompt sheet because that was literally what it was. I created it to help me when tasting, and it would prompt me. So I would see a color green in my mind, or a color green would come to my mind when tasting. Then I would go to the green area, see all of the different flavors associated with green, and think, oh, is it grassy? Is it apple? Is it lime? Yes, it's lime. That's what I taste. And seeing the words would prompt me to help me identify what I'm tasting. And that's the same when you're in a room of people and somebody will say, I taste basil, and someone else will say, oh, actually, I taste something herbal, and I couldn't figure out what it was. And yes, it's basil. So then when I'd done the painting, it looks slightly like the shape of Africa. The middle part it's slightly lighter in the middle. I thought that looks a little bit like a map, and that sounds a bit nicer. The chocolate tasting flavor map sounds a bit nicer than a prompt sheet. So I ended up calling it a flavor map because it looks a little bit like a map, and it is a map of flavors. And even though I'm a food scientist, people expect it to be quite complex and technical, but it's really not. It's very simply categorizing flavors by color, and there's no specific detailed scientific reason for why certain colors are next to one another. My approach to tasting is to try and make it as accessible and approachable to as many people as possible, because whilst I have an interest in various areas of the whole chocolate supply chain, from being at origin to chocolate making, I feel like helping consumers understand craft chocolate, how to appreciate it, and how to make it less daunting, more approachable. It is an investment to spend money in craft chocolate, and maybe that puts people off quite a lot. So I like it to be as simple and approachable. I don't really believe in having certification to be able to taste and appreciate chocolate. It's fair enough to go on courses to help you, but I want it to be as accessible to as many people as possible. And that's what I feel Taste with Colour helps simplify things. And I also like that it's just a concept as well. There's so many flavours, and there's different flavours that are common in different countries as well. So sorry, I'm looking up at it because it's in front of me as I'm talking about it. So I have it in 8 different languages now. And as I've translated it with help, I've also considered flavours that are common in the countries in that language.
I was curious about that because so much of our tasting vocabulary is culturally influenced in what we're exposed to. So you adapt that to different regions?
Absolutely. So, for example, rhubarb is probably more common it's a very common flavour in the UK, perhaps less so in the US.
Here in the Midwest, it's fairly common because it grows naturally here. So we get rhubarb pies and things like that.
Okay, great. So it's more a Northern Hemisphere, I think. When I was converting it into Brazilian Portuguese with friends in Brazil, there's so many amazing flavours there, like cupuaçu, which is the cousin of cacao, but I've tasted a bar by Arcelia, who owns Mission Chocolate.
Oh, I've had that bar. It's excellent.
It's just such a mind-blowing bar, and it's such an amazing example of flavour, because it's candied cupuaçu, and the flavour of that candied cupuaçu pulp is just out of this world. It's bubblegum like, and that's what inspired me to put bubblegum on the English map. But then in Brazilian Portuguese I put cupuaçu because most people in Brazil are familiar with the flavour of the pulp rather than the beans. You can make a cupuaçu with the beans, but people are very familiar with the flavour of the pulp, and it's this explosion of a sort of banana-y, floral, grapey flavour which come together and it tastes like bubblegum. I think it's crazy. So that inspired me to put bubblegum on there, because even though it's not really a common natural flavour that occurs in chocolate, I thought it was a really interesting flavour to taste in the coupe Poisson, and somebody else had told me that they have found those sorts of flavours, and sometimes it's hard to put your finger on what it is, and bubblegum actually is the easiest descriptor for some of those notes that you can get in flavoured bars or occasionally in a plain chocolate bar.
So those would go in different colors then as you were changing those vocabularies.
Yeah, so I convert the flavors into the different language, and then I would add and remove different flavors that either weren't necessary or would be very applicable to that country or region.
So let's give people a better sense of how this works. Walk us through a quick example if somebody was doing this for the first time of how you would instruct them to use the map.
We'll be right back.
Hey everyone, Final Gravity Issue 5 is now available in the shop on beantobarstool.com. This 5th issue of our zine telling personal, human-centered stories from the world of beer is full of great articles. Bono Segudu tells the story of the South African beer style Umkombothi, poignantly explaining its role in her culture and the importance in her family's celebrations and milestones. Maria Krugliak writes about discovering the Portuguese half pint after moving to Portugal during the COVID-19 pandemic. Amanda Bruns and Obakeng Malope discuss the water spirit Mamuhaswa and the collaboration beer they brewed in her honor. These and numerous other stories fill the 56 pages of this zine. We've expanded it and added a few features for this issue. It's full color, full of lots of beautiful photography and art. Definitely check this out. It's on beantobarstool.com/shop. You can purchase this issue or subscribe, and you can always support us on Patreon and get extra perks as well. Cheers.
So when I've done tastings, I will always ask people, does anybody else see colours when they taste? Because it's not necessarily something that happens naturally for everyone. It's something that happens naturally for me, but not for everyone. So I like to try and make sure that everybody's on the same page. So if they don't, I like to do a little warm up, and I just get people to think about what flavors they would associate with certain colors. So I say, what flavors would you associate with the color yellow? And then people would call out various colors: honey, banana, butter, lemon. And then I would call out a few different colors and get people in the zone. And that would then get people to start thinking in that way, because originally I thought that this concept was synesthesia, and it's not. And my understanding is that synesthesia is more abstract and unique to the individual. So you might see, you might taste a chocolate bar and see blue, which would be totally unrelated to the specific flavor notes that perhaps were in there. Somebody else would see green in a raspberry flavored bar, for example. Whereas cross-modal correspondence is apparently what it is, where I'm just associating the color of the food that has that flavor with the word and the flavor. So raspberries are pink, and butter is yellow and mint is green, for example. There are, again, some that perhaps might have a variety of different colors. So some people see licorice as black. Other people might see it as a light brown color because of their association with it. But again, it's just a concept. It's just a different way of getting people to think a little bit differently in how to express what they're tasting. So we'd have the little warm up, and then we'd just talk a little bit about how to approach chocolate tasting. I like to try and use all 5 senses. So people forget that we taste with our eyes. I'd tell them to look at the chocolate, maybe talk a little bit about chocolate bloom, about the different colors that cacao beans can give to a chocolate. And then we'd listen to our chocolate, we'd snap it and talk a little bit about tempering. And then we would smell it after we snapped it, although you don't get a huge amount of aroma from the chocolate when it's in your hands. You get all the aroma when it's melting in your mouth. And then allow the chocolate to melt in the mouth and close your eyes and just see what comes to your mind. So after having that little warm up, it gets people in the zone a little bit. And maybe if they wouldn't normally see colours when they taste, I just say, let the chocolate speak to you. It might tell you different things. It might bring up a memory. It might create a shape in your mind. And then also with some painting workshops, which are really interesting, I get people to just paint what they taste, or paint whatever it is that comes to your mind. Sometimes people paint a memory. Sometimes they paint shapes. Sometimes they paint circle or a journey of flavour, because as we know with craft chocolate, what's so amazing about it is that it's a flavour journey, and that's what's so different about craft chocolate versus mass-produced chocolate, is that you've got a beautiful flavour journey.
I imagine because of the different ways that people's minds work, you probably run into some degree of cynicism or reluctance sometimes. Like, how do you respond with somebody who just isn't buying in?
Yeah, absolutely. So I have had some people come up to me who I've never met before, who have never been to a workshop, and say, wow, this is amazing. I love this way of tasting. This really works for me. I don't even need to explain it to them. And then I do have some people that come up to me and go, I don't get it. And I say, that's okay. You know, I can explain it to you if you like, but if you don't get it, that's okay. And I want people to feel comfortable to choose their way of tasting. You know, we're human beings, we're all very different. We all have different styles, and it's very rare that one thing will work for everyone. There's different ways of tasting, and we're all built and programmed differently. So it's not for everyone. And I don't ever believe in forcing anything. So if people aren't interested, they don't get it, and they're not interested in trying to understand it, then that's absolutely fine. There's other ways of tasting, and it's not a problem. And I encourage them to perhaps explore other methods of tasting to find what works for them. It's as simple as that, really.
On your website, you talk about the idea of cross-modal correspondence in other sensory experiences. Can you explain that a little bit and give some examples beyond tasting with color?
Yeah, so there's quite a rabbit hole you can go into with this, and there's so much cross-modal correspondence happening everywhere that we don't really realize it. So some other examples that you can include that relate to chocolate is texture. So the way to describe texture, or if you looked at a chocolate bar and one had sandy cut type textured image or style of artwork, and then one had more waves and smooth curvaceous, they would already influence you in how you would perceive the texture of the bar. Even just touching something smooth whilst eating some chocolate will influence how you taste it. And then they're also used as descriptors. So you can use images to describe a texture, and sounds, and there's even a wine company that has pictures of members of family on each bottle, which is their way of describing the wine, and that will already influence you or give you an idea of what it will taste like. Or it's using, you know, people's faces or personalities to describe flavor. So there's so many different ways you can look at it in terms of different shapes and sounds and personalities and color and texture and all sorts.
How many years has it been now since you first developed this?
I think it might have even been July, actually, in 2017. So it's actually 5 years.
All right, time for a
And I
celebration.
haven't been counting. You just brought that to my attention.
That's great. You got to celebrate.
Yeah.
In that time, how has this influenced your own tasting process? You developed it, but since you've kind of been leaning into it, I wonder if it's influenced even further how you experience chocolate.
Yeah, I still use this way of tasting, and I think it's helped me when I taste with other people that they also find it helpful when they're tasting. So for example, when I'm doing chocolate judging, I will have it in front of me and other people will be looking at it, and we're pointing to certain areas, and it helps facilitate how we communicate what we taste in the bar and our flavor journeys and our flavor experience. So I'd say that I still taste the same way. I still use it and it's helpful, and it fulfills the need that I was looking for why I created it. But what's really helpful now is that it has created this common language with other people that I'm judging chocolate with, or if I'm doing a tasting workshop, it helps people communicate what they taste a little bit more easily, in a more simplified way of saying, I also get yellow, but I wasn't quite sure what it was. So it simplifies the way I taste, and that then means it's easy when I'm tasting with other people to have a little bit more of a common language.
This process feels like it would be particularly beneficial for relatively inexperienced tasters who maybe would feel kind of intimidated by the idea of trying to pick apart these flavors. What benefit would you say Taste with Color has for more trained tasters or chocolate professionals who already have a framework for tasting?
I did a tasting workshop, and somebody who is a very experienced taster, they're a chocolate judge, they've done chocolate tasting training courses. They said a really sweet comment which really touched me, and they said that they felt more empowered to share what they taste after my workshop, even though they were really experienced. And what I try to promote, I try to empower people a little bit when we're tasting, because I spend a lot of time talking about how we all taste things differently. You know, we all have different biochemistry, we all have different backgrounds, and what you taste is what you taste, and you're not wrong. And I think that when you go down a route of tasting certificates, and I've done them myself. I've done the WSET, Wine, Spirits and Education Trust, which is a very big body in the drinks industry. I've done the wine tasting and the spirits tasting. And the whole point with those training courses is that it's a very systematic approach to tasting, so that you can judge very objectively, and assess the quality of a product. But what I do with Taste with Colour is I try to empower people to share what they taste and say that there's no right or wrong, that we all taste differently. What you taste is what you taste. And that then makes people feel more comfortable in sharing what they taste, because if you've got flavour notes written on a chocolate bar or on the back of a wine bottle, and you're at a tasting and you're tasting blind, I even feel it myself, where I feel a little bit nervous or shy to share what I taste, because what if nobody else tastes that? And then they think I'm stupid, or they think I'm not a very good taster because I taste something different from everyone else. So I really try to empower that into people to be confident in sharing what they taste, and that maybe it reminds them of something that somebody sitting next to you has never tasted in their life. You know, I've done these tastings in Thailand, in the Caribbean, in Europe, and you know, a whole variety of people have been tasting. So maybe when I'm doing a workshop in Thailand with the same chocolate bar, they're going to find flavor notes that perhaps something from Thailand, like a herb from Thailand, that somebody in Amsterdam or the Caribbean has never tasted before. So that's the main thing I like to try and instill in people, is that there's no right or wrong. It's all about you having fun and enjoying the journey and getting the most out of the chocolate, because the more people that enjoy the experience of tasting craft chocolate, the more people in the rest of the supply chain that will benefit from it. So that's the main thing. And having this one person say to me that they felt shy tasting, even though they've got a load of, qualifications in tasting and experience in judging and all of that credibility, they felt more empowered to share what they tasted after my workshop, because I'm trying to focus on empowering people to believe in what they taste and not be shy about it.
I love that. As a trained beer taster, I think all of us that are trained in whatever field it is, in some ways, the more trained you are, the more self-conscious you can be once you get beyond those concrete descriptors, because it feels like you're losing your objectivity. You're letting go of that concrete training, and you're just starting to get kind of vague. And I like the permission that this grants to just let our brains do the weird things that they do.
Exactly. It really is almost a type of meditation. It really gets people to go inside themselves. And what I love as well is that when I go around the table and ask people to share what they tasted, especially when they've painted, I've given them one square of chocolate and they've got all of these colors and shapes on a little piece of paper that they've painted, and they can spend 5 minutes talking about that chocolate. Whereas if you've just given it to them and said, what do you taste? They sort of feel this pressure. Whereas if you give them this more insular, introverted way of expressing themselves on a piece of paper through a certain medium with paint and a paintbrush, it's fascinating to see what comes out of people. And I also try to, empower people as well to not criticize themselves with saying, oh, I can't paint, because that happens a lot. People say, oh, I'm not creative, or I can't paint. And I say, everybody can put their paintbrush in some water and in some paint and put it on the paper. You can paint. And if you limit yourself with that, then of course you're not going to be able to if you tell yourself you can't. And to say, just put all that to one side. Painting or creativity is an expression and not a skill. And that helps as well. I just try to remove some obstacles that I can to just allow people to just focus on themselves and on the chocolate and just see what happens. So my biggest fear is somebody says, I just taste brown. And they just paint a brown square and say, I just taste chocolate. But, sometimes that can be somebody's experience, and that's okay as well, As I said before, not everybody's going to get it. So
you said that you're a trained wine and spirits taster. I'm an advanced Cicerone, so I'm a trained beer taster. Have you found that this process translates over pretty well to other food and drink categories?
So it was 2018, I did the level 2 in wines, and I started trying to create a wine version, and then other projects took priority. So I still have a draft painted somewhere. And I was actually trying to do a coffee version, but I got stuck because there's so much overlap of flavors and the color categories of flavors in coffee and chocolate. So I have used my chocolate taste with color for coffee tasting. So sometimes gone to a coffee cupping where everybody's brought loads of bags of coffee and they do a traditional cupping style tasting. And I've had the color map there, and it helps. Again, it's just simplifying the vocabulary and to try and bring a different type of common language that's a little bit simpler for people to describe what they're tasting. I haven't yet done any painting with coffee, but I think that's the most similar food or drink that is similar to chocolate, basically. It's the most overlapping of flavors that means this map would be useful for coffee. But there are other foods. People talk about cheese, but again, the colors would be probably quite different in cheese. There's probably more meaty, hammy, interesting flavors in cheese that this color map wouldn't work for cheese.
We'll be right back.
Hey everyone, my book on pairing craft beer and craft chocolate is available now on Amazon and on the Bean to Barstool shop. Pairing Beer and Chocolate, a guide to bringing the flavors of craft beer and craft chocolate together, is out now. This paperback book explains the process of pairing beer and chocolate, includes a guide to hosting a pairing at home, walks through dozens of beer styles to provide style-by-style pairing guidance, and gives room for taking your own pairing notes along the way. This is the only book on pairing beer and chocolate available. Grab your copy now at the link in the show notes or on Amazon. If you manage a tap room, bookstore, chocolate shop, or cafe and want to stock the book, get in touch about our easy wholesale process. Beer and chocolate belong together, and this book is your guide to getting the most out of every pairing. You mentioned the cultural exchange that takes place when you're tasting with somebody of a different background or from a different location. And that's something that I love about the tasting experience. Does that ever lead you to update your version of the map as you kind of gain new vocabulary, or is it pretty established at this point?
For my main English version, I've only made one update since I first created it in terms of the flavors that are on there. I had earthy and soil, and I realized that they're basically the same thing. So I removed soil because earthy covers it, essentially. It's a bit broader. And I did add Marmite, which again might be very British. Do you guys have Marmite or know what it is?
I know what it is, but it's not really a part of life over here.
Yeah, so in Australia, they have Vegemite, which is their version of Marmite. So they are familiar with it and they are obsessed with Vegemite over there. But I'm aware that it's quite a British flavour, Marmite, but it is this salty yeast extract. And sometimes it's really vivid in chocolate. And I actually put it on there because I tasted so many chocolates and I got such a vivid Marmite note. I had one chocolate once when I was judging the Academy of Chocolate Awards a few years ago that literally tasted like Marmite and peanuts, that it made me crave peanut butter and Marmite on toast. And I went home and made some peanut butter and Marmite on toast because a chocolate bar tasted like that.
It's funny that you mentioned earthy. Back in the winter, I have a painter friend, and I did an episode where I had her taste some chocolates and some beers without knowing what they were, and she just created spontaneous paintings from them. And at one point she was tasting earthy notes and she was painting that as a vibrant bright green, which to me earthy was, it's a brown gray, like soil like color. And so I put a question out on Twitter of like, when you just hear earthy with no other context, what colors go along with that? And the range of colors just blew me away, from gold and yellow through all the shades of brown and into green. And like everybody had a slightly different idea of what earthy was.
Yeah, that's again just going back to how individual tasting is, and you could interpret every flavor in your own way, and taste with color is just a concept to get you to think about things in that way. And flavors are missing, or I've put flavors in some places that is my interpretation, and usually it's related to the color of the food that the flavor comes from itself. Mm-hmm. The main exception is vanilla, but I think most people would associate vanilla with a light creamy white color because most vanilla flavored products are that color in nature. It's also quite a soft, delicate, aromatic flavor that dark brown doesn't seem to work, even though a vanilla pod would be dark brown. But yeah, it's really interesting. And that sounds like synesthesia, the bright green, but everybody has their own expression, and that's what's so amazing about life. We all have such different viewpoints and interests and ways of expressing ourselves in life that it's sort of infinite, to do different tastings and to hear different ways of expressing yourself.
The way my painter friend explained it, she used to be a florist. And so when she thinks of earthy, she thinks of what's growing out of it. So she was thinking very planty colors, even though the flavor itself was earthy. It was just really interesting, the connotations that came from that. So what chocolates have you been enjoying lately? What have been some favorites that you've been getting into?
So I have just been doing some judging remotely. So I have got a lot of leftovers that I've been enjoying. But last year, when I was judging the Academy of Chocolate, we're obviously limited with the pandemic of how to rewrap everything. But I discovered one maker when I was judging that really blew me away. So I only tasted a couple of the bars that I really like. So I decided to buy a variety from their range, and that's Coruna. They're based in South Tyrol in Italy. Mm-hmm. And I'm quite a texture snob. I like a smooth texture. I generally love, really crunchy pork crackling and things like that. I'm really into texture, and I like my chips or your day fries to be really crispy. Mm. So when it comes to chocolate, and I make chocolate myself, I know how easy it is to make it smooth and creamy. I can make it at home smooth and creamy. And I'm aware that it's sometimes people's style to make it have a little bit of a grainy, more, I would say, more masculine texture, to have a little bit of graininess to it, a little bit rough around the edges. But what I love about Coruna is that they are exceptionally smooth and creamy. And they had this hazelnut bar that really blew me away. And I've made about 2 or 3 orders since last summer when I discovered them. So I've still been eating some of those that I've bought recently. And there's a hazelnut bar, which is a dark milk made with roasted cashews as the milk, with then roasted hazelnuts. And they're very dangerous because I can eat a whole one very quickly. And that's the kind of chocolate that I really love. I love tasting single origin bars, but I'm really into the slightly more confection side. I really like salted caramel. Caramel's actually not a huge thing over here in the UK. There's a lot of salted caramel flavored things, but not many people buy caramels, whereas I think in the States it's massive. And I know a lot of chocolate makers say that's what pays the bills so they can make chocolate. I love caramel. So last week I went into Paul A. Young store. He's a chocolatier here, and got a salted caramel filled bar. And again, very dangerous, eat it very quickly. But that's the kind of stuff that I love and doesn't last long in my house. Whereas the single origin bars, I like to taste them and have a little bit now and then with my black coffee in the morning, but I can keep them for a long time. A lot of people say, how do you have so much chocolate in the house? Some people can't live with that chocolate in the house because they will just eat it. But if it's that kind of chocolate that's got milk and nibs or some caramel or something like that, that's the kind of stuff that I go crazy for and does not last long at all.
Enjoying chocolate or beer or another food or drink is about more than our sense of taste, but it's about more than just our senses to begin with. Our connection to specific foods and drinks and our vocabulary for describing flavors and aromas can be influenced by the culture we're a part of, our national or ethnic roots, where we've lived, our religious or socioeconomic backgrounds, and many other factors that don't, on the surface, seem to have anything to do with flavor directly. This was the subject of the very first episode of Bean to Barstool 2 years ago, provoked by my wife and I realizing that we were bringing very different vocabularies to the experience of tasting one very complex beer. Back in episode 16, we spoke with Dr. J. Nicole Jackson Beckham about the cultural influences of flavor vocabulary, how to make the flavor lexicon of beer specifically more accessible to people of diverse backgrounds, and how the tasting experience itself can be used to invite new people to the table and expand our own understanding of flavor. Hazel shared how interesting it has been for her to use the Taste with Color flavor map with folks from other countries and cultures, and it's a great reminder that when we approach the tasting experience with humility and vulnerability and open ourselves to the stories our fellow tasters have to tell, we get a deeper appreciation for chocolate, beer, and the amazing experience of flavor. I'll put links to those past episodes and to Hazel's website and social media accounts in the show notes. Thanks again to Hazel for coming on the show, and to all of you for listening. I hope you enjoyed this episode of Bean to Barstool.